Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation series where I engage with writers and thinkers whose work help us to understand history, politics, and society. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Paul McGarr to discuss his recent book, Spying in South Asia, Britain, United States, and India's Secret Cold War. We'll be focusing especially on Kerala's unique place in this history. Paul, thank you so much for joining.
No problem. Thank you, Sudeep. It's marvelous to be on the program. So thank you.
So let me start with the broad question. Your LinkedIn bio says that you work at intelligence studies at King's College London. So, what exactly is intelligence studies and what does this field explore?
It's a really good question. So, intelligence is very much a contested term. So, the study of intelligence as a sort of academic discipline is relatively new, and it's not particularly widespread in the United Kingdom. Much more sort of coverage of intelligence studies in US universities than in the United Kingdom. But King's College London has a specific centre called the King's Centre for the Study of Intelligence, which was created just over 2 years ago. And that centre is really looking at why intelligence is a really important part of international relations and interstate diplomacy. And it's going back really to the work of a Cambridge historian, quite an eminent Cambridge historian, Christopher Andrew, who began working in the sort of 1960s at Corpus Christi College in Cambridge. And Chris Andrews' basically tenet was that intelligence is a really important facet of diplomacy, but it's never really talked about. It wasn't talked about at that time. And he regarded it as a missing dimension in international relations. So, international relations has been subject to intelligence activity, all the way back from the beginning of time. But certainly at the beginning of the 20th century, intelligence services became institutionalized. So Britain's intelligence services, MI5 and MI6, became formally sort of institutionalized in 1909, the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947. So they're relatively new in the grand scheme of things. But intelligence as a component of international relations and diplomacy, I think, is something that hasn't really been considered as fully as it should have been. So at King's College London, we're trying to sort of plug that missing dimension really and show how policymakers, prime ministers, presidents, national governments, regional governments use secret intelligence as a core part of their diplomacy really. So it's not just about sort of intelligence as a sort of James Bond type of activity, which we see on in media and on films. It's very much about looking at intelligence as a really important facet of diplomacy. And I guess if I were to sum up intelligence in one word or a couple of words, it would be giving policymakers decision advantage. So giving them access to privileged information that's usually secret, that they wouldn't have had access to before, which enables them to make better policy decisions. So that's really what it comes down to.
I just want to tell you that your book is already creating a lot of discussion in Kerala. And we're also going to have an election in the coming next year. These accusations, especially the accusation against CIA involvement in Kerala politics in the late 1950s, is not something new. Communist parties always accused the Congress party and the other right-wing forces that they collaborated with CIA to topple the first elected communist government in Kerala. So in your book, what exactly the new documents or evidences you're discussing in your book?
So you're right. I don't think these allegations are new. They've been swirling around in India and elsewhere really since the 1950s. I think what's changed is in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, governments, particularly in the United States and the United Kingdom, less so in India, unfortunately, though I'm working with Indian archives to try and uncover documentation on Kerala and on what went on in the 1950s and 1960s. But certainly in the United Kingdom, the United States, national governments have released documents that show that the intelligence services of the United States, principally the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and in Britain, a variety of intelligence services, actually, both MI5, the British Domestic Security Service, which really had control or had primacy about what went on in terms of intelligence within the British Empire and former British colonial territories. So India was really the sort of remit of MI5, British Domestic Security Intelligence Agency, well into the 1960s when MI6, Foreign Intelligence in the United Kingdom, really took over its remit. So both of those intelligence agencies were heavily involved in the Cold War and in India. And interestingly, another propaganda agency, an agency called the IRD, the Information Research Department, which is a shadowy covert propaganda arm of the British Foreign Office that had very close links with MI6 and basically engaged in black propaganda, grey propaganda throughout the sort of the Cold War period, really trying to undermine communism across the world by sowing false stories, so made up stories about what communists and communist governments are up to, but also using semi-true stories or grey propaganda to embellish and amplify stories that had a grain of truth in them. And the Information Research Department was really active in India and particularly active in Kerala. So one of the things the British government really took on board in Kerala was, how can we change the narrative about the communist government in Kerala? How can we paint it in a less than sympathetic or sort of positive light? And one of the reasons they tried to do that, one of the methods they used, is to put propaganda material that was not attributable, so it wasn't open, into the Indian press through Indian academics to try and undermine what was going on in Kerala. So that was just one arm of it. So both the British and the Americans were very active in southern India and in Kerala from the mid-1950s onwards. And of course, the catalyst for that was the election in 1957 and sort of the coming to power of a communist government in Kerala, which really, I think, did send shockwaves through London and Washington, particularly Washington. I mean, you have to remember back, this is the height of the Cold War. Tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States are extremely high during this period. The United States is really worried about communist advances, particularly in the developing world. And the election, the democratic election of a communist government, was something very difficult for the United States to process. It was like, well, are we losing the Cold War? Is communism gaining beachheads in the developing world, which is going to be really problematic for the United States? So lots of sort of analogies were made to the Chinese Communist Party and Yan'an as a sort of beachhead for communism in China from the mid-1930s onwards. And this was all, is this being replicated in Kerala? Is Kerala going to be a beachhead? And then communism will spread throughout India and particularly into Southeast Asia. Remember, this is a time when the Vietnam War is beginning to gain traction from the mid-1950s. So there's a genuine concern that the United States, the United Kingdom, has to do something to combat communism in India, indigenous communism. But interestingly, they work very closely with the Congress government. So this is not a covert action or an intelligence intervention that doesn't have support from the Indian government at the time, the National Indian Government, the Federal Indian Government, and the Congress Party. So there's a sort of a collaboration that goes on between India and the United States, the United Kingdom, to try and suppress or subvert communism in India in the 1950s.
So when I went through some of your chapters, it's very interesting that what you're exploring is that the British intelligence, United States intelligence, along with Indian government, collaborated together to oust a federal government, which is actually against all the constitutional values of India. I would like to ask you that throughout this Cold War period, we can see a kind of a paranoia in the mind of British and the United States intelligence and also governments to curb any communist possibility in Asia. When we look at the theories like domino theories and all, that once one state falls into communism, that will lead to another state and all. So do you place the same paranoia and in that context, Kerala's history also?
Yes, I do. I think it is based on paranoia. And interestingly, quite a lot of intelligence officers, British intelligence officers, but also American intelligence officers at the time, and I'm talking in the 1950s and 1960s during the Cold War, actually fed back to Washington and London that the threat they assumed was represented by communism in India was overblown, it was overstated. So people on the ground in India were saying, look, we don't really need to worry about indigenous communists in Kerala too much. Don't become fixated on it. Don't become paranoid about it. It's not going to sweep across the whole of India. There are pockets of communist activity, particularly in Kerala and West Bengal at this time. The British and the American intelligence officers on the ground are saying, don't overreact. Don't amplify this threat beyond anything that's really reasonable. But that was really ignored in London and Washington, I think, because of Cold War paranoia. And you're absolutely right. These activities, these covert activities, were against Indian law. They were against Indian national law. They're also against international law at the time. So this is intelligence activity that is, ironically, the British and the Americans are presenting this as a need to save democracy by compromising democratic principles. So it's almost like the Vietnam analogy where we had to save the village by burning the village down. It's like, well, how does that really work? You're saying you're trying to defend democracy, but you're subverting democracy in the process of trying to defend it. So there's a tautology and a sort of paradox there, I think, that's quite strong during that period. But yeah, there is a sense, I think, amongst many that actually communism in Kerala is pretty benign. So lots of the reports that are fed back by British and American intelligence agencies are, this is a little bit frustrating for us because actually the communists are doing a decent job. Administration in Kerala, literacy rates are rising, education's okay.
Land
they seem relatively
reforms.
competent. Land reforms are happening, relatively competent in terms of administration. So one of the things they're struggling to find in the 1950s is a pretext for launching this action. They can't really pin malgovernance or corruption or inefficiency on the local communist government in Kerala. And that's particularly problematic because when we think back to communist administrations before 1957, they had been relatively inefficient, relatively corrupt, and poor administrators. So in many ways, the British are saying, well, it's no wonder that the communists were elected in Kerala in 1957 because the Congress Party, took its eye off the ball. Their administration in Kerala just wasn't up to standard. And so the voters quite rightly rejected them because of corruption and maladministration. So it's difficult for the British and the Americans to really come up with a local reason for removing that government. They couch it very much in international Cold War terms. And you're absolutely right to reference the domino theory. It's very much a question of, well, if we let communism grow in Kerala, then the rest of India will be next, and then Vietnam, and then Indonesia, and then Thailand, etc. So this is something that's the sort of framework they put it in. But interestingly, people on the ground, as I said, local intelligence officers are unconvinced by that logic.
And also, even today we know this paradox of exporting democracy through coups or military interventions, etc. So your book is very interesting and important in Kerala because these accusations, like I mentioned, these accusations are not new. But whenever the communist parties, that now there are two major communist parties in Kerala after the split, whenever they invoke this in the public debate, they are often mocked or ridiculed by opposite parties by saying that why big powers like United States or CIA should be interested in Kerala, which is a small territory, not even a state, state in the international law sense, and also does not have any standing military or anything, which is just a federal unit. So why they should be interested here? And also communists are often accused of finding international conspiracy behind everything. So why Kerala is important again? It's just a federal state. It doesn't have any much power, but still that kind of a fear that communism will grow from Kerala. Was it really rooted in any reality, or is it exaggerated?
Yeah, two really good points there, Sudeep. I think the first one is the symbolism of Kerala. So it's not Kerala as an economic unit or a political unit, or in terms of its population or military industrial potential. It's Kerala as a symbol internationally for the ability of communism to win elections and to gain power in an administration without resorting to violence or without resorting to the gun. So that notion that communism could win at the ballot box rather than via the bullet is really important in the context of the 1950s and into the 1960s and 1970s. So it's really Kerala acting as a watershed. So, for example, San Marino had elected a communist government in the 1940s, but
which is in Italy,
it's in Italy, a really small nation state that's really insignificant. A very, very small population. Kerala is the first significant area of the world to democratically elect a communist government. And because it's that watershed, that's why it becomes so symbolic. And people like Khrushchev, the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, references in speeches in the 1950s the fact that communism appears to be the wave of the future because communist governments are being democratically elected around the world. So he's using that as a public relations tool, a propaganda tool, to undermine the message of liberal capitalism in the 1950s and 1960s. That's why I think it's so threatening to the West, not because of Kerala per se, but because it's this huge, powerful symbol of what's coming. I think the other really important point you raised is about conspiracism. And I think one of the reasons I think communist parties have struggled to really to gain traction with that message that we are under threat, we are being subverted by the United States, the United Kingdom, is traditionally, I think, Indian governments, both local and national, have weaponized that threat of conspiracism in ways that have been unhelpful. So I'll give you an example. From 1947 through to certainly the late 1960s, maybe the Indian national election of 1967, the CIA was very active in Indian domestic politics. It was bribing politicians, it was intervening in trade unions, it was trying to influence the way Indian voters were behaving at the polls. Undoubtedly, it was doing that. There's lots of evidence. Really, from the late 1960s onwards, the CIA sort of switched attention away from India. It moved to Southeast Asia, it moved to other areas. At that point, really from 47 to 67, the Indian government was saying nothing about the CIA. CIA wasn't in Indian newspapers. It wasn't being referenced in the Indian parliament. It was under the radar, really, partly because India was collaborating with the CIA, but for other reasons as well. After the sort of 1967 election, politicians like Indira Gandhi find it politically useful to weaponize the CIA as this malevolent force. So she amplifies and exaggerates and takes too far what the CIA was actually doing in India, both from 1947 onwards, but particularly in the 1970s, when the CIA isn't really doing very much in India at all. So I think she lacks credibility. And we have like members of the Indian press, the Times of India, the Indian Express, the Hindu, are printing stories saying, look, this is ridiculous. You're over-egging this problem. We do think the CIA is doing something, but you're blaming them for everything that happens in India. Like if there's a cyclone in Orissa, you're blaming the CIA for that. It's just comical. So I think just by over-exaggerating the threat and trying to use conspiracism as a useful domestic political tool to win votes in India, Indian politicians have sort of created a problem that they can't now control. So this notion of, and it's still very much prevalent in Indian politics, this notion that the CIA is subverting Indian politics. The CIA is active in India. Every intelligence agency is. But I don't think there's a grand plan to subvert Indian democracy. So in a way, Indian politicians, while I have a huge amount of sympathy for them, because the United States and the United Kingdom were at various points subverting Indian democracy, I think they've sort of weaponized it, or they've over-egged the problem, really.
In your book, one of the chapters, you are mentioning the ways in which these intelligence agencies worked in Kerala, like funding some trade union leaders of the Congress party, and also giving them some kind of training, even taking them to Britain and giving them some kind of training how to combat communism and all those things. But one very interesting thing for me is that even the top leadership of the Congress party, including Jawaharlal Nehru, had information about these things. Why particularly Nehru is because Nehru has a great image of being a Democrat. That in the first cabinet, he even invited opposition leaders to join his cabinet, and he's respected across the political spectrum. May not be in the Hindu right wing today, but all the political parties generally respect Nehru for being a Democrat. So what exactly was Nehru's role in this entire episode?
It's a really interesting point. And I think whenever we think about national politicians, we tend to paint them in sort of black and white colors, really, but actually they're shades of gray. And I think with Nehru particularly, he was very, very, a very prominent promoter of democracy and anti-colonialism across the globe, really, from the 1940s onwards, and acquired this status as of an arch sort of proponent of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism, and standing up to neo-colonialism in the form of the United States after 1945. So there's this strong image of Nehru as someone, a highly principled individual, willing to stand up for what he thought was right and being a Democrat in doing so. I think the actual picture is slightly more complicated. So Nehru is trying to balance all the time national sovereignty against national security. And that's a really difficult balance to strike, really, which is why Nehru on occasions holds his nose and works with the Central Intelligence Agency and with British government to try and retain that sense of Indian national sovereignty. So it's interesting because Nehru has been highly critical, for example, of the CIA's involvement in Iran in 1953 in the coup that overthrew the Mossadegh government, in which the Central Intelligence Agency and MI6, British intelligence, were active in overthrowing democracy in Iran in 1953. The United States also does so in Guatemala in 1954. And when they overthrow the Arbenz government.
Arbenz
government, yeah. And Nehru knows that's happening. He knows the CIA have been responsible for that. But interestingly, it doesn't stop him in 1957 when he feels as though he needs intelligence support to draw on that support from Britain and the United States. So there is a a paradox, there's a compromise that Nehru is making on his principles, because I think at that stage he thinks that it's necessary to safeguard the Indian state. And I think, again, although I think these fears were wildly overblown at the time, there is a sort of consensus in the international community, really after 1947, that India is quite fragile. It could break up. The nation state is in a position where it's not as stable as it is now. And so there's potential for that to happen. I think Nehru is acutely conscious of those threats to Indian national stability and the federal state remaining a whole, really. So that happens to some extent. And I think the other thing is Nehru, I think, sort of kids himself. Like prime ministers and presidents often give vague instructions to intelligence agencies, but they want to maintain what's called plausible deniability. So I'm giving you a vague instruction to do this, but I don't want to know the details. I don't want you to come back to me and talk to me about it. I'm not going to put anything in writing. I want to be able to deny this if it goes wrong or if it's politically problematic. So US presidents famously have plausible deniability. They instruct the CIA to do something, but they don't really want to know the details. I think Nehru is doing the same thing in 1957. He's sort of saying, get rid of this problematic government for me in Kerala, but just don't tell me how you're doing it. Even though he knows what's happening, I think, it's undeniable. He's aware that intelligence activity is taking place, and India is cooperating with Britain, the United States, in that intelligence activity. He doesn't really want to know the details. He's sort of holding his nose again and thinking, I don't really want to know the details of this sort of thing. So it's almost that plausible deniability thing that's going on. I mean, interesting.
So he wanted that to be happened, but not much involved in that.
Basically, yes. I think he gives his agreement to it, but in the vaguest possible terms he can, and sort of subcontracts responsibility to the Home Minister and to the B.M. Malik, his intelligence supremo, and sort of says to them, look, just get on with it, but I don't want to know the details about what's happening here. So, I mean, interesting, on the political side of things, there's been, again, other historians who've written about the extent to which Indira Gandhi plays quite a prominent role as well. So this notion that Nehru wants to get people around him to take responsibility for the dirty work in Kerala. He doesn't really want to sully his hands at that time. I think that's partly what's happening in 1957. But interesting, 57 is really seen by the CIA as a sort of model of how to construct a coup quite effectively. So often CIA coup activity can be quite messy, can have quite a lot of blowback or unintended consequences. That happens in Guatemala, it happens in Iran, happens elsewhere in South Vietnam in the 1960s. Kerala is often held up as a really successful coup because it doesn't really have that political problem afterwards. So, and the CIA still, I think, look in the 1960s and say, Kerala was one of the things we should try and replicate elsewhere across the developing world because it worked really, really well. So, yeah, there are lots of interesting things that come out of 57, I think.
When we read that back and forth communication between intelligence agencies and diplomats and all, sometimes it's very comic, and sometimes it looks very absurd that even though they are collaborating, both these intelligence agencies were also convinced that the local Congress leadership is not that good in containing the communist upsurge or communist takeover of Kerala and later maybe India. So why they were not having that much confidence in the Congress party?
Yeah, I think it was just a local issue. So I think the British had quite a lot of confidence in Nehru and the centre of the Congress party. They thought that in Kerala, particularly for various reasons, the local Congress administration was ineffective, was subject to corruption, was deeply unpopular with voters, and so something needed to be done. And interestingly, that's one of the areas where I think the British intelligence contribution to what happens in Kerala in 1957 is quite significant. So again, interestingly, in terms of symbolism and public profile, it's always the CIA that usually gets the blame for what goes on in India. It's always the Americans and the CIA, and that's understandable because the CIA is much more powerful as an intelligence agency than British intelligence. It has a global reach and a global reputation, and really it's created its own problems by being involved in so many coups across the developing world over the last 50 or 60 years. So no sympathy for the CIA really in terms of its national profile, but that does interestingly how the British conduct quite a lot of covert intelligence activity in India that goes under the radar. So the British are very, very active in India, really from 1940s onwards, both working with the Indian government, but also working without telling the Indian government what they're doing in Indian domestic politics through that period. And they get pretty much a free ride. The Indian press don't criticize them. Indian politicians don't criticize them. So the British are quite big players in terms of Indian domestic politics and subversion, really from the 1940s onwards, but they don't get the attention that the CIA attract. And in Kerala, interestingly, the British are at the forefront of taking local Congress party officials and trade union members and activists sympathetic to the Communist Party, and what they describe as re-educating them in the dangers of communism, sending them back to the United Kingdom, putting them through MI5 training courses about not only the threat posed by communism, but how to deal with that threat. So how to negate local communist activists, how to smear them, how to sort of create a sort of be more effective really at combating communism. The British really take the lead in that process in Kerala, really from the 1950s onwards. So yeah, it's interesting that one of the things I think that has come out much more recently is the scope and the scale and the extent of British intervention in Kerala, which hasn't really been documented before, and it's now beginning to be documented.
So if you look at the anti-communist that struggle in Kerala, which is called the Vimojana Samaram in Malayalam, the word is Vimojana Samaram. So it was a grand coalition of various groups. Congress Party was leading, of course, but you can also see media playing a huge role, especially media like Malayalam Manorama, one of the most popular dailies in Kerala even today, and Catholic Church playing a huge role, and some other Muslim organizations playing huge role, caste organizations playing huge role. So was there any direct communication or any kind of collaboration between, non-Congress part of that Vimojana Samaram?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of evidence that the media were heavily cooperating with British and American intelligence. So I mentioned earlier that this body called the Information Research Department, which was a shadowy propaganda arm of the British Foreign Office, heavily linked to MI6, British Foreign Intelligence. That was really active in southern India and really active in Kerala, really from the sort of late 1950s onwards. And there was actually a permanent IRD officer stationed in New Delhi. There was one stationed in Kolkata, and there was one stationed in Madras in the 1960s. And the remit of those IRD officers was to go out to meet and network and cultivate Indian journalists and academics and influential people in Indian society, and to feed them information that the British Foreign Office had given them, some of which was completely false, some of which was grey propaganda that was sort of false but had been sort of true but had been amplified and curated, and to basically get that published in the local press. So there were a huge network of contacts that the British were cultivating in the Indian media in southern India, really from the 1950s onwards, all of whom some of them were being paid, some of them were being paid financial subsidies, some of them were doing it for ideological reasons, some of them I think were doing it because they just thought it was exciting to work in that sort of secret world. But they were quite effective in getting articles, anti-communist articles, and articles painting the West in a favourable light and painting the Soviet Union in a negative light into local Indian media. And those articles were completely unattributable. So they weren't linked to Britain, they weren't linked to the United States. They were published as if they'd been written by Indian journalists, even though all the information had been supplied by their British and American intelligence contacts. So that was a really widespread operation. And if someone was to ask me what is the biggest intelligence operation that the British conducted in India after 1947, unquestionably it would be that was undertaken by the Information Research Department. It would be the covert propaganda operation that was not only in southern India, it was across the entire sort of subcontinent during that period. A really deep penetration of the Indian media and particularly Indian newspapers, but also All India Radio and other sort of facets that use the Catholic Church, interestingly. So they use publications by the Catholic Church to disseminate that propaganda. So that was widely used. They used Indian universities and professors at Indian universities to do the same. So it was a really widespread propaganda operation that was surprising in its scope and scale. And what's really surprising to me was it remained secret until relatively recently. No one blew the lid on it. No one actually said that this is going on or at the time. So it was a really successful, from the British perspective anyway, operation at trying to influence Indian domestic politics.
So one last question that I assume that in your line of work, you'll have to wait a long period of time to get your information, documents, and all these things to conclude some, kind of arguments. So let me ask you one very speculative question. How long we'll have to wait to know the present involvements of these secret agencies in places like Kerala, if
Yeah,
they have anything?
there's a lot so the story is beginning to seep out, but there's a lot more to be told, and there's a lot more documentation to come out. Really, I think the the most interesting thing is this story is sort of being told from the American side, and the Americans are being a bit more open about what they were doing in Kerala in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Very, very recently, the British are beginning to release intelligence files on a very limited basis that tell us, sort of give us snippets of what's happening, but not a comprehensive story. The big lacuna, the big gap is from India. It would be wonderful if the Indian National Archives or the Nehru Library or local archives in Kerala were able to release more information. One of my biggest frustrations is this story is still being told from a Western perspective, and it's not a Western story, it's an Indian story. And it's really frustrating that we know these records are in the Indian National Archives. We know they're in private papers at the Nehru Library. And we know, for example, that local archives have papers that touch on these sort of issues. But it's almost impossible for researchers to get access to them because they're still classified. So yeah, my frustration would be, it would be amazing for the Indian government and also local or state governments in India to sort of be a little bit more transparent in enabling Indians to learn more about their own history. So that's the biggest frustration. Do I think that's going to change anytime soon? No, I don't. I don't think there's any move at a national or a state level in India to get access to these records and this type of information. And until that pressure comes from the public, I think, and from the media and from intellectuals in Indian society, the government will not release those records. So you mentioned earlier about my book creating a bit of an issue in Kerala. If anything comes out of the book, I hope it's to put pressure on the Indian government and local state governments to be a bit more transparent with their populations in terms of releasing these records, so we can really see what this history actually was and paint it in a three-dimensional scope. Because at the moment, as I said, it's very much a Western history, and I think that's deeply problematic because this is India's history. And Indians, I think, should be able to hear what their side was doing, what Indian officials were doing, what the Indian government was doing. And it's very difficult to do that. We're only getting snippets of that information, really.
Thank you so much, Paul, for giving a lot of insights to this complex history. And like I said, your book has already started waves of discussions in Kerala, and I hope it will continue. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed our conversation. And thank you for talking to me.